obviously specializes in conflict prevention, conflict transformation, and mediation in social and environmental issues relating to extractive industries, family, commercial, workplace, and labor disputes. He's a mediator for the Office of Mediation and Facilitation Services of the World Bank, and for the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman, which is an independent accountability mechanism of the International Finance Corporation. He's president of the Peruvian NGO ProDiálogo, did I get that right? Nope. And his focus is on teaching, training, research, consultancy on the analysis of social and environmental conflict, conflict prevention, transformation, consensus building, gender and dialogue processes. Ivan is a part-time professor at the Catholic University of Peru, and as you know, has an MA in International Relations, and is, of course, one of our own parcistas, as we call them.
Really?
Yeah, we do. Ivan has written books and articles related to conflict resolution, and currently a student getting his master's degree, so he's a constant learner in gender studies at Catholic University of Peru. So please join me in welcoming Iván Ormachea.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Catherine.
You're welcome, and please excuse me for running to the other conference.
Sure, thank you. Maybe before I start speaking, if you could briefly introduce yourself, say your name and your country and maybe the program you are studying. Quickly, just.
My name is Graciela Ijar. I'm from Peru. I'm doing the MPAIR, the joint degree here. Yeah.
Okay, Graciela, thank you.
And I'm Patricia Azulo. I'm from Peru too, and I'm studying the MPA program.
My name is Melissa, and I'm from the U.S., and I'm also in the MPAIR program.
Welcome.
Yeah, my name is Frank. I've been to Peru a couple of times, and that's why I wanted to see the program, both in 1990 and 1996. So it was before and after.
Just visiting, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Long time ago.
Okay. Not that long. That was 20 years ago when I was here at Maxwell. So, yes, please.
Temitope is my name. From Nigeria. I'm a non-free fellow with Maxwell. But with some interest in South America. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, my name is Zoran, and I'm from Kyrgyzstan. And we have also a lot of questions related to the mining.
Okay. Wow, Kurdistan.
I'm Brianna Carrier. I'm from the U.S. And I have questions about tribal relations in mining. And I'm Debbie from PARCC.
Okay, thank you. Well, for me it's very special to be here today. 20 years ago, since the last time I stepped on Maxwell. So you can imagine how I feel. Really happy, excited. And gotta thank, these wonderful people that helped me to be here, Debbie, Catherine, Norma. I'm missing somebody, Luke Kriesberg. I'm missing probably somebody else, but really very grateful about that. I want to share basically some ideas related to the experience I had for the last 15 years. And I'll go straight to the point. I think we have until 1:30?
1:30.
Yeah, so I'll try to not get too deep into the details. Maybe we can, reserve more time for questions, and answers. Well, something about the organization I work for. ProDiálogo is an NGO. We're very much into the world of conflict transformation, conflict prevention. We've been, gathering, people who have been an interest in the field. It's a multidisciplinary team. And I think something important I want to point out is the type of role that we have, If you can see the second paragraph, it says we are an impartial third party. And for us, that's probably the most important asset that the organization has, because what we have seen during social conflicts in Peru during the last 15 or 20 years, but mostly 15 years, is that For instance, this type of conflicts related to mining or extractive industries, have affected so many people, and even to the governance of the country, that whenever they were, first on the political agenda, it polarized, both groups, the pro and the anti-mining, so to speak. So there were no bridges, to open up communication or to strengthen communication between the parties and to start thinking and reflecting on what is behind, the conflicts. This is basically conflict resolution stuff. So whenever we intervene, we always say to the party, we are going to intervene as an impartial third party. That means that we are not neutral. If you are into the conflict resolution, probably you know this very, very well, because being neutral is impossible. You always bring your values, your points of view, your perspectives. What you can do is, try to keep some sort of distance from all the parties. You can be impartial in that sense, but it's like being equidistant. You keep the same distance, but at the same time you become a resource whenever the parties require some sort of resource from you. For instance, training. That's something that we do, I have to say, whenever we intervene and the parties are willing, to participate in our work. That the first thing we try to do is training so that they can develop a common discourse in conflict resolution and problem solving. ProDiálogo is the result of merging of two previous NGOs, so we try always to practice what we preach. And since the year 2002, these two NGOs, the Peruvian Institute of Conflict Resolution and the Peruvian Center for Conflict Prevention, instead of competing against each other in several bids and proposals that we had to submit, we decided, we have so much in common, why not doing common work together? So, it's just like any regular couple, you get together, you live together, and suddenly you get married. So we got married in 2006, and this year we're celebrating our first 10th anniversary. Something I have to say very proudly is that in the year 2014, out of the blue, because we never applied for anything, we received this Outstanding Achievement Award from the international for an international organization from the ACR, the Association of Conflict Resolution. Okay, enough. Maybe something about Peru. Well, you can read that in that slide, basic figures and details, but something I have to say that, well, Peru is right on the coast of the Pacific Ocean in South America, and if you see Lima is the capital city, the total population is just about 29-30 million people, and almost 1/3 lives in the city. So you can see how centralized the country is, and basically from migration coming from the Andes and from the jungle. The interesting thing here about the coast, which is in yellow, is that the most populated and economically active cities, are along the coast. And the coast is basically a desert, crossed by several rivers, which at the same time create valleys from which we get, our products, for eating. The interesting thing is that those valleys have, only 5% of the drinkable water that you can find in the country, and probably 65 or 70% of the population lives along that coast. So you see that water, there's a strong pressure on water, both on the coast but also in the Andes, where you have all these farmers living from agriculture. Okay, I want to mention some important information about the context so that we can get right into the case study. Well, in 1990, we elected a Japanese Peruvian, Mr. Alberto Fujimori, for a 5-year presidential term. Now I have to say that now we're in the middle of a presidential election. We finished what we call the first round, and Fujimori's daughter is running for the second round. If you don't know anything about Fujimori, well, let me tell you something about him. Well, he was constitutionally and democratically elected in 1990, but in 1992, he did a self-coup d'etat. So he closed the Congress, he closed the judiciary, the Constitutional Tribunal, because he didn't have a majority in Congress. He had really poor relations with Congress and the other political parties. So he decided it was time, to do several changes into the country, accumulating all the power there. So by 1993, as a way of, solving the political crisis, through the assistance of the Organization of American States and other international NGOs, there was an agreement among all the political parties, and a new constitution was written in 1993. And also that was the beginning of the writing of a new legal and political framework for the country. Peru adopted the Consensus of Washington policies. Don't know if you are aware of those policies, but basically neoliberal policies, that meant the aggressive privatization of public companies done by Fujimori's regime, and fostering any policies to attract foreign investments in order to speed up the economy. Unfortunately, Fujimori was involved in several scandals, corruption, violation of human rights. You have to remember that Peru had an internal armed conflict which started in 1980. The good thing is that in 1992, the two major terrorist groups' leaders were captured, and that was basically the end of what we call the beginning of the end of terrorism and armed conflict in Peru. But still, Fujimori got involved into corrupted practices, and also, as I said, violation of human rights. Fujimori is now in jail, sentenced by corruption and violation of human rights. And in the year 2000, he fled the country because, his main advisor was state, bribing, congressmen and judges and, you name it, all sorts of political leaders and important people from the government. So he fled the country, and after a year, we elected, democratically another leader, and so far we've been having like 3 governments under the new constitution and democracy. The important thing is that during this time, the beginning of the century, there was this boom of the price of commodities, basically metals. So let's just for you to see, for instance, this is, prices from the 1980s even, but if you focus on the year 2000 and up, for instance, the price of gold, it almost reached in 2011 the price of $2,000 an ounce. An ounce is 30 grams. And now the price has decreased dramatically. It's 1,237. But if you see the first 10 years, the price just went up and up. Same thing happened with copper. Here you can see the prices. These are in US cents. So if you see 500, it's $5 actually. But by the year 2011, it passed $4.50 a pound of copper. Now it's $2.18, so you can see the prices have lowered down. Silver, also in the year 2011, it almost reached 50% an ounce. Now it's $16. But you think about, the very first years of the century. Now we are going downhill. But anyway, what happened, during those years? According to the Ombudsman's office, the number of social conflicts started to increase. From the year 2006, I'm sure there were more than 82 conflicts. 2006 was the beginning of the social conflicts program in the Ombudsman's office, so they started to collect some data. But I'm sure there were much more than 82. But by the year 2009, you almost have 300 conflicts. Suddenly they decreased, but still you have more than 200, and it seems like there's like a plateau here, more than 200 social conflicts every year and every month in Peru. Most of these conflicts are related to the environment. Here you can see in the blue line. And again, they have increased steadily during the years. And the interesting thing is that you can also see the increase of investments on mining. Why? Because most environmental conflicts in Peru are related to mining. So mining was creating strong pressure on natural resources, and communities were not happy due to several reasons. We can talk about that later. And that was creating conflict. And in some cases, conflict was really violent. Here is just some data about how many people were dead or wounded in social conflicts during the last 5 years with the current presidential term from Mr. Ollanta-Humala. 59 people have died because of environmental conflicts or social conflicts in general, not only environmental. And more than 1,800 people have been wounded. So this is a serious matter. And actually, it's the second most important matter that have been identified in the political agenda for this new presidential campaign. How do we handle social conflicts? What do we do with them? That was one of the major questions. The good thing, though, in terms of economics, is that our GDP started to increase. I think the States was decreasing at the time, but we were, growing and growing. So at some point, people started to think, yeah, we are heading, we're going to become first world countries. But that's not true. So from the year 2003 to the year 2013, there probably an average was over 6% of growth in GDP annually. Now that's decreasing because the prices of metals are decreasing, and we are a main exporter of metals, copper, gold, silver. Something interesting too, the good thing about the increase of our GDP is that the figures on poverty decreased dramatically too. I remember the year 2000, it's not here, but in the year 2000, 52% of the national population was under the poverty level. By the year 2002, it's 22%. So you can see there has been a huge impact favoring an important part of the people and strengthening what we call the middle class. But unfortunately, if you get deeper into figures, you realize, here maybe you cannot see it so well, but if you compare the rural and the urban population, what you have is that the urban, there is a huge gap between the urban and the rural. The rural have still a very high percentage of people under the poverty line. In the year 2007, it was almost 75%. 3 out of 4 people were under the poverty line. But now it's 46, I believe. And in urban areas, it's only 15. So you see, still the rural areas are affected by poverty. Let's talk about the case. By the way, this is called the case Huachaca. If you have some time, maybe you can go into YouTube. You're gonna see how indigenous people, get together every one week, every year, to weave this rope bridge. This is the Apurimac Valley Canyon. So they use natural fibers to build this rope, and they build it. And this is custom coming from the Inca times. We use it as a way of expressing the type of work we do at home. We always try to weave bridges among parties in disputes. So anyway, the Constancia comes from a mining project It's actually located into a Quechua-speaking peasant community of Chilloroya in the upper highlands of Cusco, in Chumbivilcas province. 85% of its population under poverty level, as you can see. You know, the national figures and averages are great, but if you go into the local, you will see still high numbers of poverty. The altitude is about 1,400 feet, really high. I don't know how many of you have gotten that high in your life, but it's really difficult to breathe at the beginning. The local economy is based on agriculture and cattle, basically llamas and sheep. There was previous mining there, and something that I found really interesting in that local community is that the men were extremely masculine. How would you say that in English? Virial? Is that a word? Huh? Macho, whatever. Why? Because, for instance, having a horse in that local area, you know, it's a matter of prestige. It's a matter of sort of demonstration of how much money you have and power. And they have developed like, well, maybe this is not the best way to describe it, but would be like cowboy festivals there. And as a way to prove their masculinity. Once every year they meet and they do that type of festival. But also whenever there are disputes among men and communities, sometimes they meet once a year in a specified community to have fist fights as a way of solving disputes. Communities they do about the same, although they are not fist fights, they're basically battles. And sometimes the people get killed. And so, you know, it was interesting to understand the way of thinking, because that's giving you the idea that whenever there are differences and conflicts, you are going to face somebody who is willing to win, to prevail over the other party, and even physically. Previous mining left several mining impacts in the territory. So this community was not, had some sort of bad experience related to previous mining because of impact in the environment. We were contacted by a junior Canadian mining company called Norseman at that time. Now it's Hat Bay. And after what we call the entering, which is the first stage that we always go through, both the mining company and the community accepted our participation. What I want to say here is that there are at least a couple of challenges here, because the first thing that you have to understand is that if we are, you know, if somebody wants to make contact with us and wants to have us as an intervener, sooner or later this issue of funding comes. I mean, who's going to pay for our work? This creates a sort of problem and a challenge. Problem because the ideal world would be that there is some sort of funding that you can go to, you know, in order to fund interventions from third parties. That does not exist. Such a thing is probably good in the ideal world. So somebody has to pay for that. And usually mining companies pay for our services. In some cases, local governments, in some cases the national government. In rare cases, communities have enough money to pay for our services, but they provide some sort of support more into the logistical than into the financial. The thing is, the question that comes though is, how can you try to be impartial if you are funded by one of the parties? And that becomes a huge challenge. Because what we do is, well, we have this problem, who's going to fund this thing? So the first thing we do is to share this with the community. And we, in a very transparent way, based on one of our principles, which is integrity, we tell them where the money is coming from. And we tell the company, okay, you're going to fund our intervention, fine, but we are not going to be your contractors. We don't work as your contractors. So even in the case of mining companies, for instance, they have very high regulations related to security, safety, community relations, health, and things like that. We can go through some of those processes, but we will never accept, for instance, any identification from the company, because that would be just too much. We always say, okay, we're going to work with you, but we want a sort of peer relationship with you. The same type of relationship that we have with the community. And we explain that to the community, we explain that to the company, and so far it's been working well. No? Although we know that the communities always want to see if what we say is true by the way we act in the field. And so far I think it's proven successful how we deal with this. So that's probably the main challenge that we have to face at the beginning, and we try to learn about the local context. That's something very important. And for that we write what we call a baseline, something I believe that is very typical in this type of work. The second stage is what we call the assessment of the setting. You know, we do a map of stakeholders, and we try to understand what type of capacities they have for constructive management of conflicts and dialogue. We also want to understand the dynamics between the stakeholders, basically communities, local government, and the company. We identify conflict issues, hidden agendas, which are very common. And we try also to identify what spaces communities have, for instance, where they make decisions. Some of them are very informal. They can be a marketplace, they can be a community place, etc. What were the main issues for this in this dispute? You know, because when we were contacted by the mining company, the main problem for the company was that they were stuck with a community. They couldn't operate doing what they call exploration, which is a stage on mining that takes up to 4 years or more. And they were stuck because a couple of families from the communities were doing what we call artisanal mining. They were extracting some dirt and ground from the land, from their land, but which at the same time was part of the legal mining concession for the company. In Peru, if you want to start doing mining operations, you have to get what we call a mining concession given by the national government. Because according to our constitution, all the natural resources in the underground belongs to the national state. So here, right here, you have a major conflict based on culture and values, because for these communities who have lived there for their entire lives, when somebody comes and says, I have the right, to exploit or explore the natural resources in the underground, you have the right in the surface, they say, well, that's your interpretation, but try to do so without our consent, So you have a clash there between culture and the legal aspects. But anyway, in this case, the problem was that, and I think the company was acting in a very legalistic way. I didn't say this, but I'm a lawyer on paper. I never practiced. But it was interesting to see all these lawyers, trying to explain to us, their legal rights and how solid they were in their grounds. But we say, yeah, but how are you going to deal with the peasants, They don't understand that type of speech. You got to also, put on their shoes and understand what they think. So, it took time for them to understand and explore, some options. And on the other side, the community was very much interested in getting jobs, benefits, development projects on agriculture, and the fulfillment of previous agreements. There's something that it has become unfortunately customary in Peru, which is the signing of agreements. Even the state does that. Local, national, regional governments sign agreements with communities, but they don't fulfill the commitments. So that increases frustration and becomes another issue. Anyway, the interesting thing here is that we identify the issues, and now we had to start what we call the designing of this intervention strategy, which require a lot of planning, some sort of designing together with both parties. You can see the women there, voting, and some of the beautiful area there. And then we start what we call the implementation stage. In this case, we had what we call a dialogue table. As you can see, there's no table. It was basically like a general assembly together with all the peasant, well, not all, but most of the peasant community. The interesting thing that we found out is that the peasant community itself didn't trust their leaders. And that's very common for several reasons. One of the reasons is that sometimes people think that they're going to be bought by the company because of corruption. Corruption is a major problem in our country. Or sometimes they want to believe, because they don't believe, so easily. We have an annual report coming from this organization, the Latino Barometer, and Peru is found one of the most, distrustful countries in Latin America. So we don't trust each other. Brazil is, I think, the winner. But anyway, they wanted to be there. I mean, the decision makers were in front, but there were a lot of people hearing, observing the process, and we were facilitating the meetings. What we always do, as I said before, is start a capacity building program, so that there can be a speech created, and we organize the process. I'm not going to go through that because I'm running out of time. Oops, let me see the previous here. How did we end this process? There was agreement, yes, there was an interesting agreement, and that required a lot of internal negotiation in both groups, within the community and within the company. Within the community, we had as an ally a woman who was in charge of community relations, and we explained to her that the only way to solve the dispute with these communities who were doing the artisanal mining was to provide some funding so that they can do this in a very formal and environmentally friendly way, because they were doing it in a very artisanal way without taking care of the environment and just making a profit for the two families. So we then told them that there were several examples of that type of agreement between mining companies and local communities. And also, after several months, because this takes months, actually the process took almost 2 years, several months, the community decided to start a program to formalize this mining activity under some conditions. For instance, they recognized also legal rights to do this mining. I mean, part of the concession was given to this community so that they can do this type of mining, under the condition that it could not be a large or middle scale activity, and that they were going to formalize all their processes. On the other hand, the community got some benefits from development programs, projects, and things like that. So, and also the community had to, deal with interests from these two communities, from these two families who were doing the business, related to extracting dirt to sell to other mining companies. At the end, the parties agreed on the main issues. And what I have to say is that I would not say that it was a successful process, because successful is, I think, it's just too ambitious. These are relationships that evolve over time, and at this time, I think both of them were happy. I think this is one of the four mining projects that have been developed during the last 4 years. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, there are several other projects that have not developed because of poor community and mining relationships. But still, the good thing is that they got into a good agreement. But every now and then, this type of relationship goes into conflicts, goes into tensions, and that's actually how how extractive industries and communities relate. I mean, don't expect that by just signing an agreement, everything is just perfect. It's just a process, ups and downs, goes forward, backwards. But still, they have a good, decent relationship, and they try to work their differences using dialogue as a process. And if you can read more and see actually the stakeholders, we have video, even with English subtitles, that you can see the Constancia case and 3 other cases. There you have the links. So that's basically what I wanted to share. I don't know if you have any questions or answers. Yeah.
Questions. So, in your experience, would you say that the local governments sometimes are part of the problems and sometimes are part of the solution, and sometimes they oppose even the official position of the national government with regard to mining or oil or other extractive industries? So, in your experience, is this because sometimes from what we receive from the news are these perspective from the national government that these local governments lack capacities, they lack this political will to enforce norms or agreements. So would you say that, so what is the main flaws that these local governments have in terms of prevention of social conflicts?
Yeah.
And what is the role that they play, if they play a role in these scenarios?
Yeah, actually that's a good question. I know you're Peruvian, so probably it would be easier for you to understand, but let me explain something. Middle and large scale mining projects in Peru are under the supervision of the national government. If it's a small scale project, the regional government, in which that project is operating, is the one in charge of supervising it. So here you have a serious problem. If the central government is based in Lima, how can it supervise, a project which is so far away? So you don't have people there. They depend on whatever information they get from the regional government. Unfortunately, the main problem between the regional and the national is that sometimes they don't understand each other. They come from different political parties. Sometimes the regional office on mining doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the staff or the knowledgeable staff, to provide some sort of information. So in this case, for instance, the community didn't want to deal with the government in any case, not the local, not the regional, not the national. We always try to think, and also mining companies, bring the state, because actually the social needs that you see in this case and in many other cases in this type of territories is that communities lack, health, educational services, water supply, electricity, and things like that. And, the important thing is that the government assumes its responsibility to fulfill those wishes. Unfortunately, the state or the government is absent. And the first thing that the communities demand to the mining companies are these type of services. So whenever there's this type of process, we try to bring the state here, but communities sometimes, and we have seen that in several cases, they don't want to have the state. And in some cases, not in this case, the local government is seen also as a sort of a competitor of resources, because the local government will also have some demands on the mining company. So I think that's one of the problems of this type of interventions, which I think makes us realize how much work you need to do to institutionalize, these agencies, these governmental or government-related agencies, so that actually they could do this type of work, not depend on a third party or not depending on funding from a mining company. Some things have been done to improve this, but still, communities don't trust the state, as you can know. Yeah. Somebody else? Any other question?
Okay, maybe I can just make a comment. It's not a question.
Okay, sure, please.
But it fascinates me that we have similar problems. We don't have metals, but we have oil.
Mm-hmm.
And the government, the central government, owns all the land and the natural resources. And so there's always this constant fracas between the local community who have been displaced by oil exploration and the oil companies. The typical case is in the Ogoni region of the southeastern Nigeria, where they stopped Shell from exploring oil following the killing of one of their environmental activists years back. So for me, seeing this also happening in Peru and seeing the way it's being dealt with, one thing we lack in our part of the world is we do not have things like conflict management. It doesn't exist. Negotiating, it does not. Typically, what the oil companies do is to identify the tribal leaders and then introduce them into a corrupt system, bribe them, give them money, then suppress other people. But ultimately, it doesn't work, because ultimately people get to agitate. So for me, the role of conflict management, strategic negotiation, conflict resolution, it's very fundamental in this kind of situation. And for me, I hope this is a takeaway, back home. And I hope somebody will listen, and we can begin to look at alternative strategies for dealing with some of these situations. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. What I would add to your comments is that I think Peru, and this is not only my opinion, but according to the United Nations Development Program, which has a regional office in Panama, Peru has a very important experience on what we call dialogue in the extractive industries field. And what I would say also is that on the one hand, we have very good experiences, maybe this is one of them, but we also have the worst experiences. But the good thing is that we are getting, learnings from both, from the good and the bad. And the national government and many regional governments have started some years ago, actually, to pay attention to the need to institutionalize dialogue as part of conflict management processes, not only this type of activities, but in any sort of social conflict. So I think if you want to get more into understanding how dialogue and conflict resolution works between extractive industries and communities, I think Peru is an interesting case. Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
So I was just kind of curious
Yes, please.
Just because like the parties that you're working with, you have on one side maybe a larger, rich company, and then on the other side, like smaller, rural communities. So, I mean, as someone who's facilitating, do you ever kind of struggle with like maybe the lack of capacity or resources on one side, and how do you maintain neutrality in these situations?
Yeah, well, good question. And I like that question also because it's related to one of the key things that we have to always reflect on. Actually, that's why we don't use the word neutral. We always use impartial. And if you see one of the videos that are right there, it's interesting because the lady who was in charge of the community relations office in the mining company said that, yeah, we heard about ProDiálogo because, you know, they do a good work, blah, 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 blah. But at the beginning, we were not so convinced that they were going to be impartial. And that, for me, that was like eye-opening because, you know, you kind of think, well, if somebody is going to start a, you know, like a contract relationship, although we don't like to talk about contract, but to talk about a covenant or something like that, it's based on trust. But they wanted also, almost like the community, they wanted to see, to believe. And for us, I think it's good because whenever we go into an intervention, we want to work with all the parties. We want to identify asymmetries. And of course, the community is basically, most of the cases, the weakest party. Although it has some sort of power sources because they can block the roads and the whole thing stops. But if we find some sort of asymmetries or something that we believe is unjust, we stop the process and we try to deal with that. Because otherwise, you know, you are fostering a process that is unjust, and we don't want to do that. So for us, it's very important that our role is understood, and that's why many companies, after our first interview, have decided that ProDiálogo is not what they want. They want an advisor, 100% for them, to empower them. You say no, go to many consultancy firms. They'll be happy to have you. We do special work, to work together, have a good relationship with everybody. That's our policy.
I have another question. So
Another question, Gracie. No, please.
so there's
Yes.
last week I think that in the jungle in Plus Petro, which is an oil company, the indigenous community took the facilities, and that has been happening a lot. I mean, I think that every year the indigenous community goes and take the facilities in order to like try to reach an agreement or something like that, because that's, I mean, that's their pressure mechanism, that's their power, you know.
Yeah, that's
But
true.
that happens every year. So, I mean, I know that there are several problems there. Like the environment is very damaged from several years ago, and the presence of the state is very weak as well. But I don't know. Are you aware that some of these initiatives are being taking place there, or what is the company doing? What is the state doing in that?
Actually, when was that? I think that was a couple of weeks ago. If you check on the web page of there's an office on dialogue and sustainable development from the national government. They work on the field of dialogue and conflict resolution. They have published a book on dialogue process with the indigenous population in the Amazon river, Amazon basin related to this case. And it seemed that everything was working well, but you know, the case is so complex, and besides, you know, you have these oil spills every now and then, and that, you know, creates new issues on the agenda that I'm not really surprised that this is going on and on. I actually get really furious with this case because this has been happening for 50 years in the country. For me, it's basically a policy of racism against the indigenous peoples in the Amazon. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of things still to do, but the government, I think, needs more political will to implement the solution. And it's not. I mean, it's the end of this government. I don't know if they're going to do anything else. It's sad to say, but I think it's very racist. They could have done much better, 50 years with the same things going on and on. It's just sad.
Okay, one question.
Yes, please.
This project has some influence to the environment. So, if yes, how the community agree with that influences?
You're talking about this.
Yes.
Let me see. Well, I have to say something. Dealing with an industry such as mining or oil, it's always very controversial.
Yeah.
You have all these writings on extractivism, for instance, and post-extractivism, which is extremely critical on the way how natural resources are being exploited. Probably you've heard about the course of the natural resources, which is an explanation that says that countries with a lot of natural resources are cursed because instead of helping them to grow, they help sometimes the autocratic dynasties in power, maybe in the Arab world, maybe in Africa, or maybe undemocratic countries such as Venezuela, or maybe they support corruption and sometimes armed conflicts. What I have to say is that in Peru you have several types of discourses on this, but in this case the community was willing to reach an agreement with the mining company because they were very clear that as a way to improve their conditions of living, they have to relate to mining. Because, over 14,000 feet high, the 75% of poverty, absence of the state there. I mean, you have an investment of almost $1 billion there, so it was an opportunity for them. So they were not opposed. They are very much concerned about water. I think that has been worked well, but I have to say something too. I mean, even with the acceptance of a community, these industries are dangerous. Probably you have heard about this, the collapse of this dam of mining waste in Brazil, Mariana, and that has been also a collapse in policies related to social responsibility because the two companies who are owners of these mining projects are well recognized as socially responsible in the field. I think BHP is one of them, which is Australian, and the other one I don't remember, but I mean, it's a dangerous activity. So even though you have the environmental impact assessments, studies, and you have the okay from the communities, you will always have to be concerned about that. An interesting solution that some communities have found, and also mining companies have found in Peru, is to create what they call local environmental committees, in which people elected from the community, together with the company, go through a process of monitoring the environment every now and then. So they write a protocol very clearly on how to proceed once every month or 2 months, just to check on water, on soil, on air. And that's a way to create trust too. So that has been an interesting experience too in Peru. Mhm.
Any other questions? So let's thank Ivan for joining us today.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.